It's always a little bit humbling when preparing for a homily reading a gospel that warns against religious figures wearing long robes who preach at people. So, help me kind of enter into the reflection a little bit, actually. This morning, I think we're basically being told it's through this story about scribes and widows and coins that we hear this message of Jesus about trust in the Lord and self-emptying. If you're up to it, you don't have to self-identify, but if you're up to it and you want to do a little homily participation, and if you're like me and you are kind of a dinosaur, you might actually have a couple of coins in your pocket. I don't today, but I do sometimes. Coins in the pocket. If you got a couple of coins in your pocket, or just imagine them in your hand, like hold them in your hand, we'll talk about them again in a minute. Our gospel is essentially broken up into two sections. And in the first part, it's an introduction to these scribes, right? The scribes who are sort of strutting around town in their long robes, and they're sitting in places of honor in the synagogues, and they're taking financial advantage of widows. And any time in the scriptures, whether it's the Old Testament or the New, whenever you hear references to the widows, or the widows and the orphans typically are together, that is a reference not necessarily specifically to widows and orphans alone. What that is it's a statement about justice. That in that community, at that time that this was written and who it was written to, for sure, widows and orphans were the most vulnerable members of society. So when the scriptures are talking about widows and orphans, they're calling out for justice in that community. Justice can be defined very simply in two words: right relationships. Right? To justify, to make relationship to each other proper. And so they're taking advantage of these widows. They're the spiritual leaders of the community. And the scribes themselves hold themselves up to be master teachers and spiritual leaders and future prophets. Right? Remember, prophets aren't people who tell the future. We tend to think about them that way. But prophets are much more like what referees are like in a hoop game or something. Like, prophets come from among the community, and they call out these justice issues to the community. Like in a game, when you break the rules, the whistle blows, you get notified, you get told what your mistake is, you might have a penalty to pay, and we put the game back in motion, right? That's what prophets do. And they see themselves growing into that role. And they're not at all pleased about Jesus, who's sort of cutting into their rather jealously protected territory. And Jesus and his followers show up on the scene. They're calling Jesus rabbi. They're calling Jesus teacher. And these people, these scribes, etc., they're not loving this at all. In short, Jesus was basically cutting into their money, the support system. He's preaching against what we might call the sort of conventional wisdom of the time, right? What we seem to think like has been what's become sort of our norm, and we sort of hold these norms up, and Jesus ends up having this rather very flexible kind of interpretation of rather strict Jewish rules. And this is their whole role, is to kind of uphold these rules for everybody else. That's where they're failing. They're not doing it themselves, right? We know what that's like. That's a tough community situation to be in, and Jesus is there, and he's witnessing to this alternative way. And he's talking about these scribes, and he's rooting his followers, he's rooting and anchoring his followers in this new vision where they're going to follow a new message. And he's talking about the scribes, and he's comparing them to this widow. Now, we had the widow in the first reading. It's a very similar story. Very similar story. The second part of Mark's gospel today, we see that Jesus' last visit to the temple. The temple being the thing, right? The temple is the place. First of all, it's a place that in Jesus' time is becoming very divided. It's become very divided into communities of worthiness. The most worthy, the unworthy, and everybody in between. And you're divided into these pockets by the society, because this is sort of what the cultural malaise has sort of grown into. And the temple is very much the socioeconomic center of the entire community. I don't know if you caught it, But Jesus is even referring to the temple as what? The treasury. The treasury. It's become that, right? The temple has become the treasury because 90% of the town's revenue passes through that treasury. And thus Jesus calling it the treasury he's basically calling out, if you kind of dig into the scriptural stuff there, he's calling out the design of the temple community that has now become designed to keep the rich in and the poor out. Right? The rich in and the poor out. And Jesus and his disciples are not going to be having this. So what do? Imagine the image. They're outside the temple. Everybody's going in. Jesus and his disciples are not exactly welcome members of this temple community, not by their leadership for sure. And so what do? They go right up to the front row and they sit down in front of the cash box, the donation box for the poor. And they observe, the scriptures are telling us, what people are putting in. And that's when he notices this widow. That's when he certainly would be familiar with the widow from the Jewish scriptures in the first reading. And he notices this widow. And he calls that out. And he says, it's all about self-emptying. He points to the rich and he says, these people have given a lot of money. And that's a generous thing to do, but they've given from their excess. It hasn't cut into the level of sacrifice. It's generous, but it's not self-sacrificial. The widow, he points out, all she has is these 2 coins, which in truth would be about a penny today for what we would understand value. So she's got these 2 coins, it's all she has, that's what she gives. Right? These are images we're familiar with. But this is not about money. You should be happy to hear that, right? It really isn't. It's not about money. Because what Jesus is saying is, what do these 2 coins represent? These 2 coins represent this absolute faith and trust in God and a total selfless outpouring for the benefit of the other, rooted in that faith in God, that God will provide. And whatever God might provide may not even be the easiest thing to manage, but it's been provided for a reason. That's the kind of faith that this woman is witnessing to. That's the kind of faith that's representative of those 2 coins. Faith in God, faith in one another, faith that stuff is not that important. And that's a tough message. I'm a Franciscan. This is, I think, the first time I've been here without my habit, but I've got brown on, so it should count for something. But yeah, even that, I move a lot. I don't own things myself personally, but you kind of accumulate things over time. And one year somebody gave me a book. It was a good book. It was called The Comfort of Things. And that's when I realized I probably have too many things, right? Somebody saw that book and thought I should have that. But we can get comfortable, and I think that's oftentimes what's going on in our gospel readings. They're rattling the cage of comfort for us to remind us that we are called to be generous in spirit and to share our resources, and that that's a good thing. But it's not what Jesus is calling us to do only. Jesus is calling us to be self-sacrificial. Not just generous, but self-sacrificial. That can look in lots of ways. Like I said, the coins stand for something. It's not about the coins. But I do think we're being asked to reflect on that very personally. I think it's a good question. What is it that we can identify those coins with those coins? If you have them in your hand or your pocket or your mind and you're floating them around, what is it that I can identify with these things? Imagine these things that aren't necessarily bad, but they've got a little more control over you than you'd like to admit. You want to hold on to them even though you don't need them a little more than you might like to admit. You might not trust. It may not be even something visible or physical. It might be a concern for trust. I need to be the master of my universe. I can't. Yeah, God's nice, but I need to be the master of my universe. It might be that, right? There's lots of things that these coins could represent in terms of that which could cut kind of deep within us if we gave it up. Even if it's a good thing. Even if it's a good thing. And so we're being asked to consider that, I think. Where is our faith? How deep is that? Because honestly, for everybody, it becomes a struggle at least a couple of times in their life, you know? And that's okay. You got to name it to tame it, as they say, right? But Jesus, I think it's interesting how he's reminding us today that, or maybe ironic, right? That all that those 2 coins represent in that experience, and that it's really about this relationship with God. 2,000 years later, on this side of the world, in this country, we print those coins that say, "In God we trust." Do we? Or do we trust in the coin? Whatever that coin might represent. I think we're being invited to consider that today. And then to place those things in our offering. Throw your coins in the basket if you want, but reflect on what we might be giving up, sacrificing for, sharing with, so that we might be able to walk a little bit more closely in the footsteps of Christ. And may that grace be ours.